Okay, there's two questions. One is, I think there was a story in the local newspaper, a very nice story, in which I related some of my experience as a fellow. So let me do that to you if you didn't read that story. And the second question was about oral histories of the slaves. And that, the climactic scene in this book ends in 1781. So some of those oral history, we're talking about, there's one particular history of, I believe it's Isaac Jefferson, that I rely on very heavily because he was in Richmond when the British came. And I think that may be one of the ones you're talking about. There's some others that I use just a little bit, but there's one in particular that's absolutely crucial because he describes so many things. He was a very young boy, and part of what he was describing may have been what his parents told him and that he remembered later, but he provided a very crucial description of my events. So that's part of the answer to the second question. On the first question, this is something that I talk about at every talk in detail because it really was a great part of my experience. So let me relate that here. I was a fellow in the cottage across the way, and if you go on vacation, it takes sometimes a few days to sort of slip away from the world you're in and slip into that world that you want to be in for a week or 2 weeks or however long you may have to be on vacation. And that was my idea. My day job is as a reporter for the Boston Globe, and this was in the midst of the 2008 presidential campaign. And I had told my editors, who were very supportive of this idea, that I wouldn't go until May of 2008, and there was no chance there'd be any primary fight still going on in May of 2008. And as you may remember, actually, there was sort of the tail end of that fight still going on, but it was pretty clear what was happening, and they kept to their promise, and I did actually leave at the beginning of April, but it was pretty clear that Obama was going to be the nominee. And I spent time going around Virginia, and then I settled in here, and I really wanted to step away from the world that I was in, and there's just nothing like being in a place like this, because you're able to not only come to this wonderful library, to go to the library at UVA, but you're able to also walk the path that Jefferson walked, and that was essential so I could walk the path of research and also the paths of Jefferson. So staying here, I did, and in the article described a little bit, didn't watch the TV, and for me a great sacrifice, did not read the daily newspaper. I read instead the Virginia Gazette of the 1780s because that's part of what was happening, and it's one of the great sources for this book. And I just became absolutely enamored of the music that Jefferson listened to. I've always been a fan of Vivaldi, but I got to know a lot of other composers that I hadn't listened to before, such as Corelli and Bonporti and many others. And it wasn't just because I wanted to do this, it's just I loved that music, and I listened to it the entire time that I was here. It's just wonderful, wonderful music.
CD.
And there's a CD that, that you've produced that Angie sent to me. It's just, there's just so much, Jefferson did so many... Jefferson had so many aspects. His love of books. Music was the passion of my soul, Jefferson wrote. There's just so many aspects to him. Certainly there's plenty to be critical of, no doubt. But he just had so many different things that interested him, and that being here, I'm sure all of us feel that just maybe a little of that will rub off of us. All the different things that he did as an architect and as a writer and different things like that. So, and for example, there's the first sentence of the first chapter of the book where I describe Jefferson walking up from his childhood home of Shadwell to Monticello, which is simple enough to do. But being here, I had the luxury of calling up the person who is in charge of the grounds, Peter Hatch, and asked Peter, would you take me on the exact path that you believe Jefferson would have taken? This is not a path open to the public. And he did. We went down in his truck, and then he stayed in the truck, I think, and I walked, and walked up that hill so I could sort of measure at a Jeffersonian pace how long it would have taken Jefferson to get to the top of Monticello. It's a very small detail, but it really is one of the joys to be able to walk in those footsteps. And similarly, I was able to walk through, obviously, Williamsburg, where I spent an awful lot of time and talked yesterday. I was also able to go to the place I described in the talk, Hood's Point, which is this great place where a fort should have been built. It's private property, and I very much wanted to see this property so I could describe it. And it's not publicly owned, and I could not figure out who owned it very easily. So I drove around and around the area, went to some property where they basically said, go away. And then I did what I did when I was a reporter up in New Hampshire many, many, many years ago, and that is if I wanted to find out something, I'd go to the local country store and ask the person who owned it, what did they know? And I asked this person, do you know who owns the property where Hood's Point is? And the gentleman said, yeah, he's right over there. So I asked him if he would take me, and we got in his truck and went up, and I was able to walk around the grounds of Hood's Point, which was a very, very memorable experience for me.